Iron Warriors. Today begins a different kind of video, a truly big one of those that not only inform, but organize ideas, break through confusion, and lay bare which principles within heavy duty have the most power when they are understood correctly. Because this is not about a single isolated technique or a simple repeated routine, but a deep comparison between two great methods that, when properly understood, can completely change the way of training both for those just entering this world and for those who have already spent years walking the path of iron. And that is precisely what makes this video special. Training will not be viewed from a single age, a single level of experience, or a single need, but from different stages of life, from the youth who still seeks to learn how to stimulate intelligently, to the maturity that requires precision, recovery, and absolute control in order to keep progressing without breaking down. Here, step by step, we will enter the essence of two enormous techniques. We will see what makes them powerful, how they differ, when one can be superior to the other, when one is appropriate and when the other is, and above all, what the Iron Warrior must understand in order not to turn an advanced technique into a costly mistake. Because in heavy duty, the one who wins is not the one who knows the most methods, but the one who knows how to choose the right method at the right moment, with the right dose and the right mindset. And that is why this video will not remain on the surface. It will go deep into how these techniques relate to true muscular failure, authentic intensity, recovery, frequency, joint safety, age, experience, the ability to progress without falling into excess, and that truth Mentzer defended so firmly that muscle does not respond to chaos, it responds to precise stimulus. It will also show how a young Iron Warrior can benefit from these tools if they learn not to waste energy on unnecessary volume, and how an Iron Warrior over 40 can find in them a far more intelligent path to continue building strength, mass, and functionality without subjecting themselves to brutal methods that the body no longer needs or tolerates in the same way. Because the goal is not only to train hard, but to train with judgment, not only to suffer, but to provoke adaptation. Not only to become fatigued, but to truly grow. And throughout this video, increasingly deeper topics will unfold. How to identify which of the two techniques best fits the body's current state, how to combine or separate them without making mistakes, what signals indicate the body is ready for more, what signals indicate more rest is needed, how all of this changes with more years, more training history, or more accumulated wear, and why in some cases a technique may seem less spectacular yet end up being far more effective. So, Iron Warriors, what lies ahead is not a simple explanation, but a battle of ideas, a serious comparison, a total immersion into principles that many repeat without understanding, and that here will be presented with clarity, depth, and respect for the truth of training. Because this video does not seek to entertain with noise. It seeks to lay a solid foundation to understand, once and for all, how one truly thinks within heavy duty when the goal is to progress with intelligence, and lasting results. First part of the development, Iron Warriors. For this great comparison to carry real weight, one must first understand that within heavy duty not all techniques serve the same function, nor are they all created to solve the same problem, nor are they applied with the same intention. That is one of the reasons why many become confused when they look at the system from the outside. They believe a technique is simply another way of training, when in reality each one responds to a specific need of the stimulus, fatigue, recovery, or muscular failure. And that is why this first part must begin with the most important foundation of all. The logic that makes a technique truly useful within heavy duty and not just impressive in appearance. Because what defines a technique is not how much it impresses or how much it burns when performed, but how much it improves the quality of the stimulus without destroying the possibility of recovery. That is the true center of everything. When an Iron Warrior hears about advanced techniques, they often immediately think of extreme intensity, deep exhaustion, brutal sensations, or the idea of doing something different to break a plateau. But heavy duty was never built on novelty for the sake of novelty. It was built on precision. And that means a technique only has real value if it fulfills a clear function within the process of stimulating, fatiguing, and provoking adaptation. If a technique adds chaos, disrupts execution, multiplies wear, or creates fatigue that cannot later be recovered from, then it is not serving the system, it is betraying it. That is why, before comparing two great methods, a central truth must be established. The objective is always the same, but the path to achieve it changes depending on context, age, level of experience, recovery capacity, and the muscle being targeted. Within that logic, pre-exhaustion holds a very special place, not because it is harder in a superficial sense, but because it corrects a very specific problem of traditional training. The fact that in many compound exercises, the target muscle does not fail first, but is limited by other assisting muscles. That reality completely changes how one interprets a press, a pull-down, a squat, or a row, because most people believe that if they can no longer complete another repetition, then the main muscle has already reached its limit. But that is not always true. Sometimes the chest does not fail first in a press, the triceps or shoulders do. Sometimes the back does not fail first in a pull-down, the biceps or grip do sometimes. The legs do not fully fail in a squat. The general system, the lower back, or technical control gives out first. And that is where pre-exhaustion proves its value. It forces the target muscle to get closer to its true limit because it enters the compound exercise already partially fatigued. That, for an iron warrior who truly wants to understand training, is pure gold. Because it means it is not about adding more volume just for the sake of it, but about directing effort more precisely. Pre-exhaustion does not aim to make training longer or more destructive in a global sense. It aims to focus the load more accurately on the muscle one wants to develop, and that nuance changes everything. In a world where many train hoping that something will grow because they did a lot, pre-exhaustion forces precise thinking. Which muscle do I really want to stimulate? Which muscle is taking me out before failure? Which part of the movement is stealing effective work from me? How do I ensure the main muscle receives the majority of the stimulus? Those are not questions asked by someone who simply goes to the gym. They are asked by someone who truly wants to progress. And here appears the first point that must be absolutely clear, especially when thinking about younger individuals and those over 40. For a young person, pre-exhaustion can be an incredible tool to learn how to feel the correct muscle, to reduce dependence on ego, to stop using excessive loads that shift the work onto other muscle groups, and to discover that the quality of contraction matters as much as the weight. Many young lifters enter the gym obsessed with moving more and more weight, and that often makes them lose connection with the target muscle. Pre-exhaustion forces them to slow down, control technique, and understand that the muscle does not respond to showing off, it responds to properly applied tension. On the other hand, for an iron warrior of greater age, the same technique takes on an even more strategic value. It allows work to be concentrated on the desired muscle without placing as much demand on the joints or on secondary muscles that may already be more sensitive or limited by time and experience. That does not mean doing it softly, it means doing it more intelligently. A very clear example of this can be seen in chest training. A person may perform the bench press and think they are destroying the chest, but if in reality the triceps and anterior deltoids are the ones limiting the set, then the chest did not receive all the stimulus it could have. In that case, a prior isolation exercise, such as flies or cable crossovers, fatigues the chest before moving into the press. Then, when transitioning to the compound movement, the chest is already compromised and cannot hide behind fresh assisting muscles. The iron warrior then sees something very important. The technique does not create magic, but it redistributes effort more precisely, and that precision can be the difference between mediocre progress and a truly transformative stimulus. With the back, something similar happens. Many times the latissimus dorsi is not the main limiting factor in a pull-down or a row. The biceps, grip, or even posture are pre-exhaustion by first bringing the lats to localized fatigue with a pullover, machine pullover, or similar isolation movement, allows the subsequent pull-down or row to become far more specific. The lats, already fatigued, cannot rely on smaller muscles to do the work for them. That makes each following repetition more valuable from a stimulus standpoint, and the same can occur with legs, shoulders, or any other muscle group where the chain of assistance steals the spotlight from the main muscle. But for this to work, there is something that cannot be forgotten for even a second. Execution must be clean. Pre-exhaustion is not permission to do anything carelessly. If the isolation exercise is done poorly with momentum, incomplete range, or without real intention on the target muscle, the foundation is already lost. And if the subsequent compound exercise is performed with bad technique, bouncing, compensation, or ego, the method completely collapses. The iron warrior must understand that pre-exhaustion is not a license to suffer more. It is a strategy to better direct useful suffering, if it can be called that. Because not all fatigue builds. Only the fatigue that reaches the right tissue, at the right time, and with the right intensity builds. This is where the difference between young and over 40 lifters becomes important again. A younger individual often has more margin to tolerate a certain degree of mechanical disorder without immediately paying a high price. But that does not mean they should. In fact, pre-exhaustion helps correct that tendency. It teaches control, respect for the target muscle, and avoidance of excessive momentum. In contrast, an older adult usually has far less tolerance for chaos. If the shoulder no longer tolerates as much stress, if the lower back complains, if the elbows or knees have accumulated years of wear, then technique must become even more intelligent. Pre-exhaustion can be a great solution because it reduces the need to move excessive loads in the compound exercise. Since the main muscle arrives fatigued and there is no need to turn the session into a battle of weights provided safety and control are maintained. Another essential point is understanding that pre-exhaustion does not serve all goals in the same way. There are moments when it is an extraordinary tool and others when it should not be overused. If the goal is to improve connection with a lagging muscle, break excessive reliance on assisting muscles, or give more emphasis to an underdeveloped area, pre-exhaustion shines. If the goal is to build a very heavy strength base in a technically complex movement, the method may not be the most appropriate at that moment. That is why an advanced iron warrior does not marry a technique as if it were a religion. They use it as a tool, they apply it where needed, they remove it when it no longer contributes. And that ability to choose is part of true mastery of heavy duty. There is also a psychological aspect that cannot be ignored. Pre-exhaustion changes the mental experience of training. In the subsequent compound exercise, the body no longer arrives fresh. This makes the mind perceive the set differently, more demanding, more serious, more committed, and for many iron warriors, this is very useful because it eliminates the false comfort that early repetitions often provide. The body quickly learns that it cannot improvise. It can no longer rely on assisting muscles to save it. Now it must express real effort on tissue that is already fatigued. That develops honesty. And honesty, within heavy duty, is worth far more than empty enthusiasm. But there is also a risk. If pre-exhaustion is overused, the body can accumulate too much fatigue and recovery becomes more difficult. And this is where comparison with other techniques becomes interesting, because not all tools place the same demands on the system. Some techniques increase local intensity more, others increase effort density, others demand more from the nervous system. Pre-exhaustion, when properly executed, concentrates a great deal of work on the target muscle, but it can also significantly increase localized fatigue and joint stress if done impulsively. That is why it should not be used out of trend or desperation. It must be used with judgment, and this ties directly to the difference between youth and maturity. The young lifter often falls into the trap of wanting to use a technique because it seems harder or more advanced. The older lifter, if thinking clearly, tends to understand that a technique is not valuable for how spectacular it looks, but for the return it provides relative to the recovery investment. That is the language that completely changes perspective, because the older iron warrior can no longer and should not think only about momentary intensity. They must think about the cost the next day and the performance the following week. If a technique leaves the body destroyed beyond reason, it is no longer serving its purpose. The goal is to stimulate, not to annihilate, and pre-exhaustion can do that very well when integrated intelligently. So, in this first part, what has been established is the real foundation of the debate. An advanced technique is not measured by how impressive it looks, but by how much it helps direct the stimulus to the right place without sabotaging recovery. Pre-exhaustion stands out precisely for that reason. It corrects limitations of compound movements, improves muscular specificity, helps younger lifters drop the ego and older lifters train with greater precision, and becomes a powerful resource when the target muscle is being overshadowed by secondary muscles. But it also demands more technique, more control, more honesty, and greater awareness of one's own body. And this is the point where this great video truly begins to take shape. Because now it is no longer about talking about techniques as isolated names, but about understanding what problem each one solves, who it benefits most, what its real cost is, and how its value changes when viewed from youth or from maturity. The Iron Warrior who understands this first part will have already taken a massive step forward, because they will stop seeing training as a collection of tricks and begin to see it as a system of decisions. And when that happens, everything that follows becomes much clearer, much deeper, and far more powerful. The second part of the development Iron Warriors. If in the first part it became clear why pre-exhaustion holds so much value within heavy duty, now it is time to step into the other great piece of this comparison, a technique that completely changes the way failure is understood, the continuity of effort, and the way the muscle responds when everything already seemed finished. Rest pause, and here it is worth pausing for a moment to understand that this technique does not belong to the same logic as pre-exhaustion, even though both can coexist within the same system. Pre-exhaustion seeks to modify the order of the stimulus so that the main muscle arrives more compromised to the compound exercise. Rest pause, on the other hand, takes the exact moment of failure and breaks it, extends it, challenges it, and pushes it slightly beyond what is normally considered the end of the set. That is the key difference from the start. One technique reorganizes fatigue before the compound. The other exploits partial recovery within the same effort to continue producing useful tension when the body had already said enough. And that distinction is extremely important, because many Iron Warriors confuse intensity with volume, and believe that any extra repetitions belong to the same world, but that is not the case. Rest pause is not simply doing more reps. It is a precise tool to move through the apparent limit of a set and discover whether the muscle can still produce an additional response after a brief recovery. In other words, the body does not fully reset, but it recovers just enough to attempt another high-value effort. And that is the key. It is not about resting long enough to be fresh again. It is about resting just enough to remain deeply committed. For a young Iron Warrior, this technique is often especially attractive because it reveals something they often do not understand at first. That failure does not always mean an absolute end, but rather a temporary pause within the capacity to continue. Many young lifters believe that when a repetition no longer goes up, the work is finished. And while in conventional training that may be enough, in heavy duty that conclusion falls short. Rest pause teaches the young lifter to tolerate the discomfort of a set that has not yet said its final word. It teaches control of breathing, maintaining technique, avoiding turning momentum into cheating, and above all understanding that growth does not depend on the emotion of the set, but on the quality of the stimulus accumulated in a very short window of time. A young person who applies rest pause correctly learns real discipline. They learn that the muscle can still fight even when the mind wants to close the chapter. And that, for long-term development, is pure gold. Now, for an Iron Warrior over 40, rest pause takes on a different dimension. It is no longer just about exploring an advanced technique out of curiosity or mental intensity, but about finding an extremely efficient way to continue producing a high stimulus without multiplying volume or excessively extending the duration of training. And this is crucial because with age, recovery often becomes more delicate, more selective, and more dependent on intelligent management of effort. Rest pause can be a blessing for this profile because it allows a lot to be extracted from a single set without turning the entire session into a marathon, but at the same time, it demands greater judgment, because poor application can lead to excessive neural or joint fatigue. It is not about doing it for heroics, it is about doing it when it truly adds value. A clear example helps visualize it. An iron warrior performs a set on a machine press or a pull-down with controlled cadence until reaching technical failure. In a traditional approach, the set would end there. But with rest pause, the weight is set down for just a few seconds, enough to recover a minimal amount of neural and energetic capacity, and then 1 or 2 more repetitions are attempted. Then there is another brief rest, and another attempt, perhaps just 1 more rep. From the outside it may seem insignificant. From the inside, however, those repetitions occur in a state where the muscle is already compromised, the mind is already fatigued, and the entire system has already crossed the apparent limit. What seemed finished still had a little more to give. And that little more, when accumulated precisely, can have enormous value. But the true power of rest pause is not only in the extra repetitions, it lies in what it reveals. Because this technique exposes the honesty of the iron warrior. It shows whether failure was real or if there was hidden margin. It shows whether technique was solid or if the person was merely surviving through compensations. It shows whether effort was properly managed or if the body is asking for a longer pause than expected. In that sense, rest pause is brutally honest. It does not allow easy self-deception. If the first part of the set was not sufficiently intense, the additional reps lose value. If the pause is too long, the technique loses its edge. If form breaks down, the method stops directing effort where it should go. It is a tool that demands respect because it punishes self-deception harshly. And here appears a very important difference compared to pre-exhaustion. Pre-exhaustion redistributes the work so the target muscle cannot hide behind assisting muscles. Rest pause, on the other hand, does not change the order of muscles nor aim to isolate before compounding. What it does is remain within the same set and push the stimulus through mini recoveries that extend effective effort. One corrects the chain, the other corrects the perceived limit. One prepares the ground before the compound, the other squeezes the ground that is already loaded. And that difference in logic is what makes this comparison so rich, because it shows that these are not 2 ways of doing the same thing, but 2 different ways of attacking different problems. In younger lifters, rest pause can be especially useful to break the very common tendency of wanting to finish quickly, do a lot of volume, and feel that work only counts if it lasts a long time. With this technique, the young lifter discovers that a single set, executed with maximum intention and finished with brief pauses, can produce a much deeper stimulus than a sequence of mediocre sets. They learn to value the density of work, not the length of the session. They learn that fatigue does not need to come from spending hours training, but from exposing the muscle to highly concentrated intensity. And that lesson completely changes their relationship with the gym. It is no longer about being there longer. It is about making every minute truly count. For the older adult, on the other hand, the value lies in efficiency and compatibility with recovery. An older iron warrior can find in rest pause an intelligent way to continue training at a high level of stimulus without resorting to volumes that overload joints, the nervous system, or recovery capacity. But that advantage only exists if the technique is used wisely, because if it is applied to every exercise, every set, and every session, it stops being a tool and becomes a constant source of accumulated fatigue. The key is to use it strategically, almost like a high-quality finishing point within a session that has already been well designed. And here it is important to go deeper into the mental component, because rest pause has a very particular psychological effect. In pre-exhaustion, the mind faces the frustration of seeing the main muscle reach its limit after being pre-fatigued. In rest pause, the mind faces the ghost of the extra repetition, that internal voice that says everything is already finished. That small rest interval between attempts becomes a mental battle. The body wants to relax, the mind wants to close the effort, but the method demands one more test and then another, if even minimal capacity still exists. This gives the iron warrior an incredible lesson. Often the limit is not a wall, but a door that opens just a little if one insists intelligently, and that feeling, properly understood, greatly strengthens confidence in one's real capacity for work. However, its risks must also be addressed, because rest pause, like pre-exhaustion, can easily be misused. The most common mistake is confusing it with an excuse to prolong the set until it becomes chaos. That is not proper rest pause, that is disorder. When too many pauses are taken, too many forced reps are added, or technical quality is lost, the method stops being an intensity tool and becomes a confusing mix of exhaustion and compensation. The other major mistake is using it in exercises that do not tolerate it well. Not all movements are equally safe for this type of work. A stable, guided, or relatively controllable exercise is usually far better suited than one that is technically risky or highly demanding on the spine, shoulders, or knees. The advanced iron warrior knows how to choose. Not everything that can be done should be done. And that idea of selection becomes very important again when discussing different ages. The young lifter may have more room to experiment and learn. The older lifter, however, should think more about sustainability. Not because they have less capacity, but because their goal is often less about testing limits out of curiosity and more about continuing to progress without excessively compromising recovery. The same method applied with the same aggressiveness in both cases can produce very different results. In one, it may serve as a tool to learn real intensity. In the other, it may serve as a tool to achieve maximum stimulus with less total volume. What matters is not idolizing the technique, but understanding its role within a larger system. And here it is worth making a key observation. Rest pause often feels more complete in the internal experience because it is lived as a mini-battle within the same set. Pre-exhaustion, on the other hand, feels like an intelligent preparation that changes the nature of the compound exercise. One is experienced as extension, the other as redistribution. One makes the muscle keep fighting after failure. The other ensures the muscle arrives more vulnerable at the decisive moment. One captures residual capacity. The other guarantees priority of the correct muscle. Two different paths, two ways of intensifying, two ways of solving different training problems. That is why this second part is so important for the larger video, because now the Iron Warrior begins to see that heavy duty is not a single recipe, but a set of intelligent decisions that adapt to the body's real problem. There are muscles that need better isolation from assistance. There are sessions where it is necessary to extract more from a single set without increasing total volume. There are stages of life where one technique makes more sense than another. And there are goals where one technique may be superior not because it is more advanced in the abstract, but because it better fits the biology of the moment. So, as this second part comes to a close, what must be firmly understood is this. Rest pause is not a trick to do more just for the sake of doing more. It is a way of exposing the muscle to a continuity of effort under conditions where it seemed there was nothing left to extract. For younger lifters, it teaches real intensity and mental control. For those over 40, it offers efficiency, density, and a refined way to keep stimulating without destroying recovery capacity. And compared to pre-exhaustion, it demonstrates that not all techniques attack the same problem or produce the same type of response. One prepares the muscle so the compound hits it better. The other pushes effort beyond the apparent pause. And that understanding, Iron Warriors, is what begins to transform this comparison into something far greater than two names or two techniques. It begins to show how a coach who truly understands heavy duty thinks not by tradition, not by trend, not by emotion, but by function, by results, and by absolute respect for the truth of the body. Third part of the development, Iron Warriors. Now that the foundations of both techniques are understood, the true value of this comparison begins to appear where almost no one looks in the relationship between intensity, recovery, and the type of real stimulus each method produces within the body. Because when we talk about pre-exhaustion and rest pause, we are not simply talking about two different ways of training, but about two completely different ways of organizing useful suffering, two ways of manipulating fatigue to achieve a precise result, and two paths that can yield great results when used intelligently, but can also become costly mistakes if applied without understanding the depth of what is really happening in the muscle, in the mind, and in the nervous system. And here something emerges that makes this conversation much richer. It is not enough to know what each technique does. One must know what type of adaptation it demands, what kind of recovery it requires, what kind of athlete tolerates it best, and what kind of mistake can ruin its effect. Pre-exhaustion, for example, has a very particular character because it modifies the natural order of effort. In traditional training, the body enters the compound exercise first and then, if energy or intention remains, more specific work appears. But pre-exhaustion reverses that logic to force the target muscle to arrive already compromised at the main movement. That may seem simple, but it actually changes the entire training experience. It not only alters the level of local fatigue, but also the perception of weight, the sense of stability, the need for control, and even the way the mind-muscle connection feels. Because when the main muscle is already fatigued before entering the compound exercise, the body can no longer hide behind fresh secondary muscles, and that forces the sensation of work to become more honest, more direct, and often more brutal from a local standpoint. The Iron Warrior stops doing an exercise and begins to truly feel which muscle was escaping the stimulus. Rest pause, on the other hand, has a more mental and systemic nature within the same set. It does not change the order of exercises or aim to bring the muscle into a fatigued state before the compound. Instead, it interrupts the moment when the set apparently dies to test whether the ability to keep pushing still exists after a very brief pause. And that makes it a technique of great density, because instead of creating fatigue beforehand, it concentrates it within the same segment of work, making the set longer in terms of effective stimulation without necessarily increasing much in duration. That detail is fundamental, because many Iron Warriors believe that all effort must be measured by total time spent in the gym, when in reality the value of a session is defined far more by the quality and density of the stimulus than by accumulated minutes. This is where age once again changes the perspective. For a young Iron Warrior, Pre-exhaustion can be a powerful lesson in technical discipline because it forces them to abandon the habit of moving heavy loads without control and teaches them to make the correct muscle work from the very beginning. At the same time, rest pause can serve as a school of mental intensity, showing them that failure is not always a definitive war, but sometimes a negotiable boundary if one knows how to manage a brief pause and return with intent. In both cases, the young lifter has an immense opportunity to learn something that will serve them greatly in the future. That true training is not about impressing, but about directing the stimulus with precision. But for an iron warrior over 40, that precision is no longer an optional advantage, it becomes a strategic necessity. Because the body no longer forgives mistakes as easily, the joints do not tolerate chaos the same way. The nervous system demands more care, and recovery becomes the ultimate judge of whether a technique is useful or not. In that context, pre-exhaustion can be especially valuable to direct the load where it should go, while rest pause can be useful to extract a great deal of value from a single set without multiplying total work. And yet, both methods share something that must not be overlooked. Both demand brutal honesty about the true point of failure, because a technique only works well if the iron warrior knows how to identify when they truly can no longer produce a useful repetition, when the body begins to compensate, when the main muscle stops being the protagonist, and when the entire system starts asking for withdrawal. If that diagnosis fails, the technique loses meaning. In pre-exhaustion, for example, if the initial isolation was not serious enough, the subsequent compound exercise will not produce the desired effect. The main muscle will not arrive truly compromised, and the assisting muscles will continue stealing the work. In rest pause, if the initial set did not reach genuine failure, the subsequent repetitions lose value because they are not extending something already maximally demanded, but simply prolonging a set that had not yet reached its true edge. That difference may seem small, but it changes everything. Another factor that makes this comparison more interesting is the relationship between local fatigue and general fatigue. Pre-exhaustion tends to generate more localized fatigue in the target muscle, but it can also make the next exercise feel awkward, unstable, or far more demanding than expected, because the body is already compromised. That is excellent if the goal is to ensure the target muscle receives full emphasis, but it also means that stability and technique must be impeccable. Rest pause, on the other hand, concentrates fatigue within the effort itself, which can lead to a more global sensation of neural exhaustion if the technique is overused or repeated too often within the same session. In other words, one can load the target muscle more beforehand, while the other tightens the continuity of effort and the system's ability to produce useful repetitions after minimal rest. Both are powerful, but each carries a different type of fatigue, and the iron warrior who understands this no longer asks which is better in the abstract, but which is more appropriate for the context. This opens a very important discussion about the real objective of training. If the main purpose is to improve connection with a lagging muscle, correct patterns where secondary muscles dominate too much, or learn to better feel a muscle group that tends to escape, pre-exhaustion usually has a clear advantage. It helps the target muscle arrive more compromised at the decisive part of the movement and forces the body to stop relying on assisting muscles. But if the goal is to maximize the value of a single set without increasing total volume too much, or to explore how far a well-executed set can go after a brief pause, rest pause tends to shine more. One is oriented toward muscular priority, the other toward effort density. That difference is subtle, but for an experienced iron warrior, it completely changes the strategy. There is also an important aspect that is often overlooked. The technique that looks more impressive is not always the one the body needs most at a given moment. Pre-exhaustion may appear less spectacular from the outside because it does not always end in dramatic last rep scenes, but it can be extraordinarily precise in making the target muscle work where it truly matters. Rest pause, on the other hand, often looks more intense, more epic, harder to watch, because there is a clear sense of continuing to fight beyond the apparent limit. But something looking harder does not automatically make it superior in every case. That is a very common mistake among those who still do not understand training as a system of decisions. The mature iron warrior knows that the real question is not which looks stronger, but which gives me the best result with the least waste. And here another truth must be highlighted. Recovery changes significantly depending on the technique used. Pre-exhaustion, if used too frequently, can leave a level of local fatigue that affects the quality of subsequent exercises or sessions if not properly managed. It is not just tiredness, it is a very specific load on the muscle that was first isolated and then finished with a compound movement. Rest pause, on the other hand, can leave a deep imprint on perceived effort and on the system's ability to repeat intense efforts within the same session. This means both methods can be highly effective, but neither should become a mechanical habit without judgment. The comparison begins to reveal something essential about heavy duty. Effectiveness does not come from blindly repeating techniques, but from knowing how to apply them with timing, purpose, and respect for real recovery capacity. For younger lifters, this lesson is especially valuable because it helps them escape the childish game of more and more. Many young athletes want to do more exercises, more sets, and more everything because they believe that is how a better body is built. But when they understand these two techniques, they begin to see that progress does not depend on accumulation, but on refinement. Pre-exhaustion teaches them to direct attention to the right muscle. Rest pause teaches them not to abandon a set too early when it still had something useful to give. That completely changes their mindset, because the gym stops being a place to spend energy thoughtlessly and becomes a laboratory where every decision has consequences. And for those over 40, these same techniques can become powerful allies if used with enough maturity to avoid the trap of excess, because it is no longer necessary to do extreme things to keep progressing. It is necessary to do the right things, with little tolerance for error and great respect for recovery. In this third part, something must also be emphasized that connects directly with the philosophy of heavy duty. Both techniques are responses to the inefficiency of traditional training, but in different ways. Pre-exhaustion responds to the inefficiency of compound movements where the target muscle does not fail first. Rest pause responds to the inefficiency of ending a set too early when it could still produce more value. One corrects the order of the stimulus, the other corrects the boundary of effort. One asks, am I targeting the right muscle? The other asks, have I truly exhausted this set? And understanding those two questions is almost equivalent to understanding the philosophy of the system in a refined form. So, if this third part must leave one strong idea, it is this: there is no perfect technique for all bodies, all ages, and all moments. There is the right technique for the right problem. And the Iron Warrior who learns to distinguish that stops training by inertia and begins to think like someone who truly understands what they are doing. Pre-exhaustion and rest pause do not only compete with each other, they also teach the athlete to observe their own body more intelligently, to recognize where work escapes, where stimulus is lost, and how to adjust strategy based on stage of life, age, and recovery capacity. And that is where this comparison becomes increasingly powerful, because it is no longer just about saying which technique is harder or which feels better, but about understanding what kind of truth each one extracts from training. One reveals whether the target muscle was truly being prioritized, the other reveals whether the apparent limit was truly the final limit. And between the two, the Iron Warrior begins to see that heavy duty is not about following mechanical rules, but about applying principles with ruthless intelligence. That is the difference between training out of habit and training like someone who truly seeks to master the iron. Fourth part of the development: Iron Warriors. Now that it has already been understood how each technique works on its own, and also how they differ in the way they attack fatigue, failure, and recovery, the most important moment of this great comparison arrives, beginning to think like a complete strategist. Because in the end, the true value of a technique is not measured only by what it does in an isolated exercise, but by how it integrates into a real training life with weeks, months, and years of evolution, with different bodies, different ages, different histories, and different needs. And that is where this fourth part becomes essential, because here it is no longer just about seeing pre-exhaustion and rest pause as two brilliant tools, but about understanding when one is more convenient than the other, how their impact changes with age, how recovery affects each one, and why an intelligent Iron Warrior does not marry a single tool as if it was six sekel with, and why an intelligent Irish Ori doesn't wise if it is an inwise, and why an intelligent Orland, where an intelligent or with a single symbiosis with a pasa or a miporth of a suffer, but posapon with or a so I'm willing or web or whatsoever with papa blub poo or pop with OF was below with odds out with our what wakata ma wa walk web what I the whistle with the wolf This is about learning to think based on context, not pride. One of the first points that must be made absolutely clear is that age does not automatically determine the effectiveness of a technique, but it does modify the way that technique must be applied. That means a young person is not necessarily forbidden from using pre-exhaustion or rest pause, but will likely use them from a more educational and technical development perspective. On the other hand, an adult over 40 should not view these techniques as advanced toys to impress, but as precise tools to obtain the greatest possible stimulus with the least amount of waste. And that changes everything. The young trainee may have more room to experiment, tolerate a certain level of chaos, and recover faster from some mistakes. The mature adult, on the other hand, must value efficiency, safety, specificity, and sustainability more, not because they are limited, but because their training can no longer depend on excess to progress. It must depend on judgment. Let's take pre-exhaustion from this perspective. For a young person, this technique can be extremely useful for learning something that is often lost in the early years of the gym: direct connection with the target muscle. Many young trainees lift significant weight, but do not always know exactly which muscle is truly working, because assistance muscles, momentum, and ego end up stealing the spotlight. Pre-exhaustion forces them to lower the noise. It forces them to feel the primary muscle before entering the big movement. It teaches them not to hide behind a heavy load that is not actually fulfilling the purpose they believe it is. That is gold for a young athlete, because it compels them to build a more solid foundation of control and body awareness. And that foundation, when built properly, can prevent years of poor execution and mediocre progress. But for the older adult, the value of pre-exhaustion becomes even more interesting, because it no longer serves only to learn how to feel the muscle, but to reduce excessive dependence on structures that may be more worn by time. If a 45, 50 or older individual notices that in a free press the shoulders take too much load, pre-exhaustion can help prioritize the chest without exposing the body to as much weight or stress in the initial phase of the movement. If in a pull-down the back is not felt because the biceps take over, pre-exhaustion can bring the lats to a state where they can no longer hide. If in a free squat technique degrades due to global fatigue, perhaps a strategy with pre-exhaustion and a more controlled exercise can allow continued leg stimulation without as much systemic strain. There the method stops being a curiosity and becomes a very concrete solution for those who need to train with more intelligence than brute force. Now rest pause carries a different kind of value. In youth it teaches a brutal truth. Failure is not always as absolute as it seems. Many young trainees abandon a set too early because they do not tolerate the sensation of reaching the edge. Rest pause forces them to face that edge and discover that there can still be a brief response after a very short pause. This develops something beyond the muscle. It develops the ability to stay focused when discomfort has already appeared. And that mental lesson is enormous, because a young person who learns not to surrender immediately at the first wall also learns to fight better for real progress. They stop confusing the sensation of fatigue with a definitive end, and that, in a system like heavy duty, has immense value. In a person over 40, rest pause can also be extraordinary, but for a different reason. It allows extracting more stimulus from a single set without needing to multiply the total training volume, and that is vital when recovery starts to become more delicate. A mature adult may not want, nor need, a session with too many sets spread across the body. They can obtain far more value from 1 or 2 truly intense, well-chosen sets, with a properly applied rest pause. That density of work can be far more efficient than a long, disorganized, exhausting session. But here the risk also appears. If used incorrectly, rest pause can leave too much local or nervous fatigue. That is why at more advanced ages, the technique must be used even more selectively, not in every exercise, not in every set, not as a habit, but as a strategic tool. And here an extremely important topic emerges: the difference between frequency and tolerance. A young person may tolerate more repetition of intense stimuli throughout the week and still recover decently, as long as it is not excessive. An older adult may need more space between sessions for the nervous system, joints, and soft tissues to respond well. That does not mean one trains better than the other, but that each body demands a different strategy. Pre-exhaustion in a young person can be used more freely for learning and correction. In an older individual, it can be used more precisely to direct load without causing unnecessary strain. Rest pause in youth can be a school of mental toughness. In an older individual, it can be a tool of density and efficiency. Age does not dictate absolute truth, but it does change the mode of application. Another point that must be clear is how these techniques affect the perception of progress. Pre-exhaustion often creates a more localized and specific feeling of work. The Iron Warrior clearly feels the main muscle burning, failing, and being forced to sustain effort when it can no longer hide. That can be especially useful for someone who needs to improve mind-muscle connection or correct a lagging area. Rest pause, on the other hand, can create a very strong sense of internal battle, because the set seems finished and yet there are still 1 or 2 more repetitions to be done. That experience reinforces the idea that the limit is more elastic than it appeared. Both effects are valuable, but they are not the same. One teaches muscular priority, the other teaches depth of effort. One refines the target, the other refines psychological resistance at the edge of failure. It is also necessary to think about how these techniques fit into a complete program. The Iron Warrior who becomes trapped in the idea of always using the hardest technique loses sight of something very important. Not all training needs to be the most extreme to be effective. Sometimes a technique works better as an occasional tool to break a plateau or reactivate muscle sensitivity. Other times it can be used during a specific phase aimed at learning better recruitment of a muscle. And at other times it is best to let it rest so the body can respond normally again to more basic stimuli. That is a huge difference between the enthusiast who collects techniques and the Iron Warrior who understands principles. The first wants to impress, the second wants to progress. The older adult tends to benefit greatly from this more strategic vision because they already know or should know that training is not won by isolated intensity but by continuity. It is of little use to have a brutal session if it is followed by several days of pain, low energy or joint disorder that prevent continuing the process. That is why judgment must always include real recovery capacity. A method may feel spectacular in the moment, but if it interferes excessively with the rest of the week, its cost may be too high. The mature Iron Warrior usually understands this better when they stop chasing spectacle and start chasing sustainable results. And that is where both pre-exhaustion and rest pause become much more powerful, because they stop being tricks and become precision tools. There is another important detail that is often overlooked. The order of muscular priorities changes with age and training history. A young person building a base can use pre-exhaustion to learn to feel muscles they have not yet mastered. An adult with years of training can use it to redirect stimulus toward lagging areas or protect joints that no longer tolerate the same patterns. Rest pause in turn can serve both profiles differently. It teaches the young that it is not necessary to accumulate many sets to feel real intensity, while for the older trainee it allows maximizing a short, highly focused effort. That adaptability is one of the reasons these techniques deserve such a deep comparison. They are not only different, they change significantly depending on who uses them. And here comes something even deeper. Both techniques force honesty with technique. Pre-exhaustion exposes any weakness in execution because, upon reaching the compound movement in a fatigued state, the body immediately tries to compensate. If posture is poor, if technique is weak, if body awareness is lacking, the movement breaks down quickly. Rest pause also exposes technique because each subsequent repetition appears when the body is already tired, and the tendency to shorten range of motion, use momentum, or lose control increases greatly. That is why these techniques should not be seen as magical solutions for those who have not yet mastered the basics. They are tools for iron warriors who already understand that without technique there is no real intensity, only noise and wear. And this is even more important for those over 40, because the cost of a technical mistake is usually higher than in youth. The emotional component must also be considered. Pre-exhaustion usually generates a feeling of control and intelligent construction. Rest pause usually generates a feeling of internal struggle and direct confrontation with the limit. That emotional difference is not minor. There are iron warriors who respond better to the sensation of precision and focus. Others are more motivated by the idea of pushing beyond an apparent endpoint. The intelligent trainer or the iron warrior who trains themselves with maturity learns to identify what contributes more in each phase. Sometimes they need a technique that makes them more aware of the muscle. Other times they need one that helps them better tolerate the final discomfort of a set. There is no universal answer, only the right answer for the right moment. Another important point, pre-exhaustion is usually easier to integrate into a session where the main goal is to target a lagging muscle group or improve contraction quality. Rest pause, on the other hand, is often more useful when there is already a base and the goal is to extract additional stimulus from a well-executed set. That does not mean one is rigidly for beginners and the other for advanced trainees, but their use becomes more intelligent as experience increases. In a young trainee with little experience, both techniques must be used with great education and control. In an older adult, both must be used with much greater intention toward efficiency and precision. If we continue going deeper, we see that pre-exhaustion can be more useful when the body still has the capacity to handle a combination of isolation and compound work without excessively increasing recovery demands. Rest pause can be more useful when the goal is to concentrate the stimulus into a single set because schedule, energy, or recovery do not allow for more volume. That is another way to compare them. One may make more sense as strategic preparation, the other as maximum density within the same effort. This difference in use is one of the key ideas of this video, because it helps the iron warrior understand that it is not about adding techniques just to add them, but about choosing the right one according to the function being sought. At the level of training culture, this also breaks many misconceptions. Many people believe that training better always means training harder in appearance. But here something much more refined is revealed. Training better often means training with more intention, less waste, more direction, and less need to prove anything. Pre-exhaustion and rest pause are two paths that lead to that understanding, but from different angles. One says, make sure the correct muscle is truly the protagonist. The other says, make sure you do not abandon the set too early if you can still obtain a useful response. Two different lessons, two deep messages, two ways of forcing the body to respond more precisely. So, as this fourth part closes, the iron warrior must hold on to a very clear idea. These techniques do not compete only in difficulty, they compete in function. The real value is not in which one feels heavier, but in which one better serves the problem that needs to be solved. If what is needed is to prioritize a muscle, improve connection, correct an assisting chain that steals work, or better protect certain joints, pre-exhaustion can be an extraordinary tool. If what is sought is to extend the value of a set at the edge of failure, obtain more stimulus density with little volume, and train the mind not to give up too soon, rest pause may make more sense. And if the iron warrior is older, both methods must be used with an even finer lens of judgment, because the cost of poor management is higher and the value of precision is much greater. In other words, this part leaves a very powerful conclusion without closing everything completely. Heavy duty is not about finding a single king technique, but about understanding that each tool has a territory where it shines the most. The iron warrior who learns this no longer trains by blind intuition, but by intelligent reading of the body, the goal, and recovery. And when that is mastered, the next step is no longer just comparing techniques, it is knowing how to combine them, when to separate them, when to use them as support, and when to let each fulfill its role without interfering with the other. That is where the video becomes even deeper, and where the conversation stops being a simple comparison and transforms into a true school of thought within iron. Fifth part of the development, Iron Warriors. In this fifth part, the video enters an even deeper zone, because it is no longer enough to compare to techniques in the abstract. Now it is time to understand how those techniques relate to other forms of intensification, to other ideas within heavy duty, and to the concrete reality of those who train in real life, whether young, over 40, an iron warrior still building a base, or one who has spent years learning to train with less noise and more truth. And here's something very important appears. When training is viewed from a serious level, techniques do not exist in isolation, but as pieces within a system where each fulfills a different function. That is why this part must not only continue comparing pre-exhaustion and rest pause, but also place them alongside other similar or related tools, to clearly see which provides more control, which provides more density, which demands more recovery, which is safer, which teaches more to an advanced beginner, and which is more useful for a body that no longer tolerates the chaos of traditional volume. One of the first comparisons that must be made is with traditional volume, because that is where it truly becomes clear why these techniques exist. Common volume, understood as many sets, many repetitions, and a lot of time under a logic of accumulation, often gives the impression of hard work, but does not always provide a better relationship between effort and result. An iron warrior can spend hour after hour repeating exercises without the target muscle ever receiving a truly decisive stimulus. That is where pre-exhaustion and rest pause show something superior. They do not seek to add more work out of habit, but to make the work actually count. Pre-exhaustion reduces waste in compound exercises by putting the correct muscle at a disadvantage before the big movement. Rest pause concentrates more stimulus within a single set, preventing training from depending on accumulating fatigue without direction. Compared to classic volume, both may look smaller from the outside, but in reality they are far more aggressive in intention and much more efficient in execution. This is something both young trainees and those over 40 must understand, because the body does not grow from making more noise, it grows from receiving the right signal. If this comparison is taken a step further, a fascinating difference appears between these techniques and training based purely on going to failure without structure. There are iron warriors who believe that simply reaching failure means they have done everything necessary, as if failure were a kind of universal stamp guaranteeing maximum stimulus, but the truth is more complex. Failure alone does not always ensure that the target muscle was the one truly exhausted, nor that the set extracted everything it could give. That is where pre-exhaustion corrects the issue of muscular priority, and rest pause corrects the issue of cutting effort too early. One places the target muscle in a vulnerable position before the compound. The other asks the body to continue producing useful output after a brief rest. Compared to simply reaching failure, both techniques are more refined, more specific, and deeper, and that makes them extremely valuable tools for anyone who does not want to train by inertia, but by precision. Another essential comparison is with negatives. Negative repetitions, when applied with control, aim to exploit the eccentric phase of the movement to generate a very high load on muscle tissue. Compared to pre-exhaustion and rest pause, negatives have a different nature. Rather than redistributing stimulus or extending a set, they intensify a specific portion of the movement. An experienced iron warrior may notice that negatives place a heavy toll on the body and require significant recovery, sometimes more than initially expected. In contrast, pre-exhaustion feels more localized and strategic, and rest pause more dense and continuous. The negative focuses on the phase of the movement, pre-exhaustion on the order of the stimulus, rest pause on the continuity of effort after the apparent end. This distinction is crucial because it shows that not all advanced techniques serve the same purpose. A young trainee may be attracted to the brutality of negatives, but might benefit more from first mastering a clean pre-exhaustion or a well-measured rest pause. Someone over 40 may find the recovery cost of frequent negatives too high, while pre-exhaustion or rest pause could provide a better balance between intensity and sustainability. Something similar happens when comparing these techniques with partial reps or forced reps. Partials offer a way to keep working within a limited range once full motion is no longer possible. Forced reps rely on external assistance to extend the set. Compared to these, rest pause has a clear advantage. It preserves independence within very short pauses and does not require another person, though it still demands honesty in execution. Pre-exhaustion also requires no external help, only intelligent exercise order. This makes both techniques cleaner from the perspective of autonomy, and older adults may value this greatly, as they may not want to depend on others for advanced methods. They need tools they can manage alone, with control and safety. A younger trainee, in turn, can learn that technique is not about how much help is needed, but about how much order is imposed on the stimulus. It is also worth comparing these methods with the drop set, because another revealing difference appears. A drop set extends effort by reducing the weight to continue working without long rest. Rest pause, in contrast, extends effort by keeping the same weight but inserting very short pauses. The drop set changes the load. Rest pause maintains the load and adjusts momentary recovery. Pre-exhaustion, meanwhile, does not even require this within set manipulation, as it already changes the muscle's position before the main effort begins. What does this mean for an iron warrior? That not all methods that extend a set do so in the same way. Some extend it by reducing load, others by maintaining load but briefly restoring capacity. and others by transforming the conditions before the decisive set even begins. For younger trainees with high fatigue tolerance, any method may seem appealing. For those over 40, the key is which one maintains a better balance between stimulus and recovery. Often rest pause preserves load intensity better. Pre-exhaustion can be gentler on certain joints if chosen wisely. Drop sets, on the other hand, can generate significant metabolic fatigue and may not always be the best ally when longevity in training is the goal. And here something even more valuable appears. The comparison with isometric techniques. A strong isometric hold maintains tension without movement, which can be excellent for certain goals, angles, or training phases. But compared to pre-exhaustion and rest pause, its logic is different. Isometrics emphasize sustained tension at a specific point. Pre-exhaustion prepares the muscle to be more dominant in a compound. Rest pause prolongs effort with brief rests. If an iron warrior seeks to improve stability, positional awareness, or tolerance at a certain range point, isometrics can be very useful. But if the goal is to apply a broader heavy-duty logic, delivering a strong, well-directed stimulus, pre-exhaustion and rest pause are often more effective because they integrate better with the idea of a brief but decisive working set. For older individuals, isometrics may be a valuable tool in certain phases, but again, it depends on the goal. Not everything that burns works the same way. Not all tension serves the same purpose. Now, if this fifth part is to truly grow, it must also compare these techniques with training based on speed or momentum. This is where the heavy-duty philosophy clearly contrasts with a common gym mistake. Momentum often creates the illusion of moving more weight, but it also shifts work away from the target muscle and toward areas that should not dominate the set. Pre-exhaustion directly combats this by making it harder for the body to hide behind momentum and assistance muscles. Rest pause, on the other hand, forces control when fatigue is already present, limiting the tendency to turn repetitions into cheating. Compared to impulsive training, both methods teach technical discipline. This is especially powerful for younger trainees, who often think strength is shown through disorder, and for those over 40, who need to protect their tissues from that same disorder. Clean technique is not weakness, it is the condition for intensity to be real rather than superficial. These tools must also be compared with a common approach of using many exercises to feel like everything was worked. That mindset often confuses variety with depth. An iron warrior may leave a very long session exhausted and still not have delivered a truly high-quality stimulus. Pre-exhaustion and rest pause, on the other hand, show that far more can be achieved with far less when execution is precise. And that is one of the most important truths of this entire video. Less does not mean insufficient when it is well designed. For young trainees, this idea reshapes their thinking, showing them they do not need endless exercise lists to build muscle. For those over 40, it is even more liberating, allowing them to train efficiently without turning every session into a survival test. The body rewards judgment, not confusion. Another important comparison is between metabolic fatigue and neuromuscular fatigue. Pre-exhaustion often elevates local metabolic fatigue in the target muscle, especially if the isolation work is well executed. Rest pause can push the continuity of effort and create a more neurological sensation, a feeling of lifting again when you thought you could not. Both have value, but they are not the same. Some iron warriors respond better to localized burn, others to the mental challenge of repeated effort after brief rest. This difference can vary significantly between younger and older trainees. Younger individuals often tolerate metabolic stress well and can learn a great deal from rest pause as a mental test. Those over 40 may find they do not need many sets to achieve a deep stimulus, but must carefully manage overall system load and recovery. Thus, the real comparison is not which hurts more, but which produces a better response at a manageable cost. Another interesting crossover is how these techniques feel when applied to large versus small muscle groups. Pre-exhaustion in chest or back can completely transform the experience because compounds for these muscles are heavily influenced by assisting muscles. In legs it can be powerful, but overall fatigue cost can be high. Rest pause in arms can produce extreme density without requiring heavy loads. In legs it can be far more demanding and require finer judgment. This does not mean it cannot be done, but that the iron warrior must consider total cost. A younger trainee may tolerate more experimentation. Someone over 40 will likely need to choose more carefully where to apply the most demanding techniques. Again, this shows there is no single truth, only a map of possibilities. It is also worth discussing something often overlooked: perception of time under tension. Pre-exhaustion often makes the compound portion feel longer and heavier because the primary muscle is already fatigued. Rest pause, despite short pauses, makes the set feel extended because the effort resumes multiple times within the same block. Both alter the perception of effort duration, but in different ways. A young trainee can learn that training is not about accumulating minutes, but sustaining quality under discomfort. An older trainee may appreciate how a brief, well-designed set delivers more than a long session. This re-education of time is very much in line with heavy-duty, less dependence on duration, more focus on stimulus quality. If we continue adding comparisons, long-term adherence must also be considered. Pre-exhaustion can be very useful in specific phases, but overuse can make training feel constantly demanding. Rest pause, if used too frequently, can turn every session into a mentally exhausting battle. So the advanced question is not which works, both do. The real question is which can I sustain over time without breaking recovery or losing quality. This is where individuals over 40 often have a heightened awareness, because their success depends on consistency over years, not short-term peaks. Younger trainees are still building this relationship with sustainability, but should learn it early to avoid paying for it later. It must also be recognized that both techniques demand serious self-assessment. Pre-exhaustion requires knowing whether the target muscle truly failed or whether the prior exercise was too easy. Rest pause requires knowing whether the initial set truly reached failure or if there was still energy in reserve. This means these techniques teach something deeper than intensity. They teach honesty. And in training, honesty leads to better decisions. A young trainee who learns this will stop deceiving themselves with weights they cannot control. An older trainee who learns this will stop insisting on methods that no longer suit them. Both benefit, but in different ways. One builds a cleaner foundation. The other protects an already built one. That is why this fifth part must leave a powerful message. When techniques are truly compared, it is not just sensations that are compared, but functions, costs, benefits, ages, goals, and recovery capacity. And in that context, pre-exhaustion and rest pause continue to show they are not simple rivals, they are different answers to different problems. Pre-exhaustion prioritizes the correct muscle before the compound and is invaluable when work is being stolen by assisting muscles. Rest pause extends the stimulus just beyond the apparent end and is invaluable when the issue is cutting the set too early. One reorganizes the entry into effort, the other extends the exit of effort. One prepares the stage, the other prolongs the scene. And both, when used properly, can be devastating in the best sense of the word. So, Iron Warriors, this fifth part does more than add comparisons. It begins to show that true heavy duty is not obsessed with a single tool, but with the ability to read the body and choose the right one. And that applies both to young trainees who want to learn to train intelligently, and to those over 40 who need to keep building without breaking down. Because in the end, the difference is not who suffers more, but who understands better what they are doing, why they are doing it, and what they are willing to pay for that stimulus. And when that understanding appears, training stops being a collection of tricks and becomes a refined practice of precision, strength, and true mastery of Iron. Sixth part of the development. Iron Warriors. In this sixth part, it is no longer enough to compare techniques as if they were two parallel paths. Now it is time to see how they intersect, how they correct each other, and how they reveal a greater truth of heavy duty. The idea that there is no magic technique, but rather a precise dose of stimulus applied to the correct problem. That is fully consistent with what Mentzer defended when he insisted that more is not better. Less is not better. The precise amount required is best. In other words, the point was not to do more, nor to do less for the sake of trends, but to find the exact balance between intensity, volume, and recovery. And when pre-exhaustion and rest pause are viewed through that lens, it becomes clear that both are tools to refine precision, not to inflate training. Here emerges one of the most interesting and least understood intersections. Pre-exhaustion not only prepares a muscle to work more, but also reveals whether the compound exercise was allowing secondary muscles to take over. Mentzer placed pre-exhaust exercises in rapid succession, with little or no rest between them, precisely so that the target muscle would arrive already compromised at the decisive movement. He even warned that training should not become a race against the clock, because rest should be as short or as long as necessary, but never more than required. That observation is a kind of technical secret. Pre-exhaustion does not seek speed, it seeks muscular priority, and that priority is gold for the young person who wants to learn to feel the correct muscle, and also for the person over 40 who needs efficiency without losing precision. Rest pause, on the other hand, reveals an even subtler secret. The set is not restarted, it simply opens a minimal window to produce another maximal contraction. Mentzer described this method as one strong repetition, a pause of around 10 seconds, and then another maximal attempt. He also noted that 15 seconds felt too long, 7 too short, and that his own testing led him to conclude that 10 seconds was the useful point for continuing to extract quality repetitions. He also gave a very direct warning. In rest pause, every rep is maximum, and that makes it extremely powerful but also very demanding. That phrase summarizes the entire method. There are no filler reps. Each one counts as a full exposure to the limit. For a young Iron Warrior, this teaches real density. For an older one, it teaches extreme efficiency, though with a more serious recovery cost. And here comes a comparison that almost no one explains clearly. Pre-exhaustion tends to tax the local fatigue of the target muscle more, while rest pause can load the entire system more due to the accumulation of maximal attempts within a single set. That difference matters enormously when considering age, joints, and recovery. Mentzer emphasized that recovery can take several days, and that training again before completing that process can short-circuit the growth process. That point changes the entire perspective. The stimulus does not matter on its own. It matters only if recovery fully converts it into adaptation. That is why, in young people, pre-exhaustion can be a great school of control and rest pause, a great school of mental toughness. In those over 40, Both must be used with more calculation because the cost of accumulated fatigue rises and the margin for error shrinks. Another lesser-known insight lies in how Mentzer viewed the different kinds of strength. He explained that the muscle has positive, static, and negative strength, and later pointed out that a set taken only to positive failure still leaves static and negative strength intact. From there, it becomes clear why, in his evolution, he often used static contractions to failure, followed immediately by negatives in exercises that allowed it. This does not mean those techniques should be copied blindly, but it does reveal something significant. Heavy duty was not a religion of a single tool, but a system capable of exploring deeper layers of effort when it made sense. In that comparison, pre-exhaustion prepares the field, rest pause squeezes the final stretch, and static negative work pushes even deeper into the architecture of failure. That is an advanced reading and precisely why it is so valuable for a major video like this. When all of this is applied to young individuals and those over 40, an even more useful truth emerges. The young often benefit greatly from techniques that teach them not to confuse volume with intensity. Pre-exhaustion corrects the tendency to move weight with secondary muscles, and rest pause corrects the habit of giving up when there was still a small but useful response left. Those over 40, on the other hand, often gain even more when techniques become instruments of efficiency, low volume, high precision, and a very fine reading of recovery. Mentzer warned that adding more sets or more frequency could push one into overtraining, and that overtime demands increase while recovery capacity remains limited. That is why he insisted on adjusting with judgment, not ego. That idea ties the entire section together. Techniques are not chosen because they hit harder, but because they solve the problem of the moment more effectively. So, the great intersection of this sixth part is this. Pre-exhaustion is the tool that forces the correct muscle to stop hiding. Rest pause is the tool that forces the body to prove whether there was truly nothing useful left to give. And static and negative work show that even positive failure does not exhaust all forms of possible tension. This combination not only expands the Iron Warrior's repertoire, but also removes the false idea that harder always means better. Mentzer was very clear that training had to be rational, precise, and aligned with the real cost of recovery, not with the desire to impress. And that is the great hidden lesson a video like this can leave behind. Heavy duty does not reward the one who exhausts themselves the most, but the one who best manages each layer of effort so that the body responds with real progress. Seventh part of the development, Iron Warriors. Now we enter an even finer level, because it is no longer enough to compare pre-exhaustion and rest pause as if they were just two different ways of suffering. What must be understood here is the complete architecture of heavy duty: intensity, volume, frequency, recovery, exercise selection, order of stimulus, and the exact management of effort. Mentzer insisted on an idea that sums up this entire part of the video. The goal is not to do more out of habit, but to find the precise amount required and, as he himself emphasized, more is not better, less is not better. The precise amount required is best. That phrase is not decoration. It is the center of the comparison between techniques, because both pre-exhaustion and rest pause only make sense when they help find that exact point, not when they distort it. From that perspective, pre-exhaustion and rest pause appear as two responses to different problems. Pre-exhaustion corrects the situation where a secondary muscle takes over and steals the set from the target muscle. Mentzer explained that by fatiguing the primary muscle first with an isolation movement, the compound exercise that follows forces the work to fall where it is truly intended. In his book, he even described clear cycles such as flies or crossovers for chest, followed by presses, and leg extensions followed by leg press, always in rapid succession, and with little or no rest between the two exercises. He also warned that extending that pause too much can ruin the effectiveness of the method, because the pre-exhausted muscle regains part of its capacity and loses the disadvantage that makes the technique useful. Rest pause, on the other hand, attacks a different problem: the habit of ending the set too early. Mentzer defined it as performing a maximum repetition, resting about 10 seconds, and then attempting another maximum repetition, repeating that pattern to complete a small block of effort. In his own experimentation, he stated that 15 seconds felt too long and 7 too short, and that 10 seconds was the useful point to sustain truly productive effort. He also gave a very clear warning: in rest pause, every rep is maximum. That is the key difference from almost any other method. Each subsequent repetition is not filler, but a new exposure to the limit. And here emerges one of the most interesting intersections for the video. Pre-exhaustion tends to be more local and more tactical, while rest pause tends to be denser and more combative. The first ensures that the target muscle arrives already compromised at the main movement. The second ensures that a single set continues producing useful tension after a minimal pause. For a young Iron Warrior, pre-exhaustion can teach control, connection, and technical honesty. Rest pause teaches not to give up too early when there is still useful output left. For someone over 40, pre-exhaustion can help direct the work without letting secondary muscles dominate the set, while rest pause can concentrate a large amount of stimulus in little time and with low volume, something especially valuable when recovery is no longer the same as in youth. But this seventh part must also show something that is rarely explained clearly: These techniques do not exist alone, they coexist with other heavy-duty tools. Mentzer pointed out that advanced techniques could include forced reps and negatives, and that intermediates could add them very sparingly. He even recommended that advanced trainees experiment with them within pre-exhaust cycles in a very specific way, without turning them into an automatic routine. In his writing, he also explained that after positive failure, there can still be room to increase intensity with carefully measured assistance from a partner, but only if the weight is maintained and the assistance is minimal, because reducing the load too much lowers real intensity. That point is crucial. Technique is not more of everything but more precision applied to the same stimulus. From there, another powerful intersection opens up for the audience. Pre-exhaustion, rest pause, forced reps, and negatives are not rivals, they are tools with different roles. Pre-exhaustion prioritizes the muscle that was being overshadowed by auxiliaries. Rest pause extends the useful life of a maximal set. Forced reps add effort with minimal assistance. Negatives explore a different dimension of muscular strength. Mentzer even spoke of 3 levels of muscular strength: positive, static, and negative, which shows that intensity, for him, was not a single doorway but multiple possible layers of effort. For a major video, this is gold. It shows that heavy duty is not a dogma of one technique, but a way of thinking in layers of stimulus. Another key topic here is the relationship between intensity and duration. Mentzer was very direct in stating that intensity and duration are inversely related. You can train hard or you can train long, but not both at the same time. That idea explains why these techniques are so valuable for both young individuals and those over 40. The young person who wants to do everything can learn that value lies in well-directed intensity, not in hours spent training. The person over 40 can understand that progress does not require more time in the gym, but better decisions within less time. Pre-exhaustion and rest pause then become 2 different responses to the same truth. If intensity truly rises, training must shorten, not lengthen. There is also a less obvious truth revealed by this comparison. Recovery is non-negotiable and, in fact, completely determines the value of any technique. Mentzer warned that excessive work consumes biochemical resources and can become counterproductive. He also insisted that the body needs several days to recover, and that training too soon can interrupt the growth process. In the case of rest pause, he himself warned that it is one of the most brutal techniques ever devised, and that if progress does not appear immediately and clearly, it is because recovery capacity has been exceeded. The same applies to pre-exhaustion. If used without judgment or too frequently, local and systemic fatigue can become excessive. That is the hidden lesson. The best technique is the one that fits within your real recovery capacity. Now, when we think in practical examples, the contrast becomes very clear. For chest, pre-exhaustion allows a fly or crossover to bring the pectoral to a state where the press can no longer hide it behind fresh triceps and shoulders. For back, a pullover or straight arm pull-down can prepare the lats so that pull-downs or rows truly target them. For legs, extensions before leg press or guided squats make the quadriceps far more dominant. Rest pause works differently. A set to failure on leg press, pull-down, machine press, or curl, followed by brief pauses of a few seconds, turns a single set into a sequence of maximum exposures. 2 different paths, 2 different sensations, 2 different recovery costs, and therefore 2 different ways of being useful for both young individuals and those over 40. And here is a key idea that deserves to be stated clearly. Often the problem is not the technique but poor context selection. Mentzer wrote that pre-exhaust should be used in moderation, that beginners do not necessarily need it, and that 1 application per week per muscle group may be sufficient. He also noted that in pre-exhaust cycles, repetitions should be relatively low and execution strict, because too many reps can increase breathing demand and ruin the transition to the next exercise. That means pre-exhaustion is not a permanent mode, but a specific tool. Rest pause, likewise, is not meant to fill the entire week with pain. It is such an intense method that he himself recommended reserving it for more advanced trainees. This idea adds great depth to the video. It is not about choosing a favorite technique, but about knowing when a technique stops being a solution and starts becoming excess. And at the end of this 7th part, the message must be clear. The Iron Warrior does not win by collecting methods, they win by understanding their exact function. Pre-exhaustion prevents the target muscle from hiding. Rest pause prevents a maximal set from ending too soon. Forced reps and negatives push even further when the situation justifies it. And all of this must exist within the same logic of precision, recovery, and honesty. That is the lesson a young person can use to stop training on impulse, and that someone over 40 can use to keep progressing without sacrificing their body in the process. Mentzer summarized it with brutal clarity. The goal is not to do more, but to do exactly what is required to grow and then leave the gym to recover. If that idea truly takes hold, then this great video is no longer just a comparison. It becomes a complete school of heavy-duty thinking. 8th part of the development: Iron Warriors. This final part of the development is no longer limited to comparing to techniques, but to closing the complete map of everything the video has been building. How a system like heavy-duty thinks when viewed with maturity. How the usefulness of each technique changes depending on age and experience. And why Mentzer insisted so strongly that progress does not depend on accumulating more work, but on finding the exact amount of stimulus required. His idea was very clear. More is not better, less is not better. The precise amount required is best. That phrase summarizes the entire logic of the topic developed here, because both pre-exhaustion and rest pause are only truly valuable when they serve that precision, not when they destroy it. In this final part, the Iron Warrior must see something that is often overlooked. Pre-exhaustion and rest pause are not rivals, they are different responses to different problems. Pre-exhaustion exists so that the target muscle is not overshadowed by auxiliaries and arrives already compromised at the compound exercise. Mentzer explained that the exercises in the pre-exhaustion cycle should be performed in rapid succession, with little or no rest, but without turning training into a race against the clock. That distinction is vital, because the method does not seek speed out of anxiety, but precision through logic. Rest pause, on the other hand, exists so that a set does not die at the first apparent failure. Mentzer described it as one maximum repetition, a rest of about 10 seconds, and another maximum effort, noting that the body can recover just enough to produce useful tension again without reaching full recovery. Here lies one of the most important secrets of the entire video. Pre-exhaustion organizes the stimulus, while rest pause extends the stimulus. One corrects the sequence of work, to force the right muscle to take control. The other corrects the boundary of effort to force the muscle to keep responding when the mind already wants to stop. For a young person, the first teaches control, and the second teaches real toughness. For someone over 40, the first can help protect joints and improve muscular specificity, while the second can concentrate a great deal of value in very little time, something extremely useful when recovery no longer forgives as many mistakes. This practical difference is part of the greatness of heavy duty. There is not just one path, there is a precise path for each problem. Another decisive intersection is recovery. Mentzer was very clear in warning that intense work can require several days to recover, and that training too soon can interrupt the growth process. In rest pause, this becomes even more serious because he himself wrote that every rep is maximum and that this way of training is very, very taxing. He also explained that, after experimenting with 15 seconds and 7 seconds, he found that 10 seconds was the useful point to continue producing maximum repetitions without completely losing the quality of effort. That detail is not minor. It shows that the method was not born from whim, but from real testing, real adjustment, and real observation. The Iron Warrior must also remember that rest pause was not presented by Mentzer as a permanent habit to fill every workout. In historical material from his journals, he noted that after a couple of months of using it exclusively, he felt the need to combine it with other heavy-duty approaches, such as forced reps and pre-exhaustion, and even warned that it probably should not be used exclusively for more than about a month. That observation is a major lesson for both young individuals and those over 40. A technique this intense can be extraordinary, but it must not become dogma. The body needs intelligent variation, not obsession with a single tool. In this 8th part, it is also important to tie together everything that has been said about other techniques in the system. Mentzer did not see heavy duty as a menu of isolated tricks, but as an architecture of intensity where pre-exhaustion, rest pause, forced reps, and negatives could all exist always within a framework of sufficient recovery. He explained that the muscle possesses positive, static, and negative strength, and that, in his evolution, he began exploring ways to increase intensity beyond simple positive repetitions. That is why this major video does not remain limited to 2 isolated techniques. It places them within a network of decisions where each tool serves a different purpose. Pre-exhaustion helps ensure the right muscle does not hide. Rest pause ensures the set does not end too soon. Negatives and statics open additional layers of effort, and all of it only works if recovery supports the process. Another key truth that must remain is that age changes priorities, but does not eliminate the possibility of progress. In a young person, the question is often how to better learn to feel and direct force. In someone over 40, the question becomes how to continue progressing without paying an excessive cost in joints, energy, and recovery. Here, pre-exhaustion can be a very refined tool to prioritize muscles and reduce compensations, while rest pause can deliver a great deal of stimulus with very little total volume. That combination allows heavy duty to remain effective across different stages of life, provided Mentzer's central principle is respected. Intensity must serve results, not ego. There is also a final psychological lesson of great value. Pre-exhaustion forces honesty about which muscle is actually working. Rest pause forces honesty about the true limit of the set. In both cases, the Iron Warrior stops deceiving themselves. They can no longer hide behind volume, habit, or the idea that feeling more always means progressing more. Mentzer repeated it in many ways. The right amount matters, recovery matters, and intensity must be authentic. Even the structure of his own rest pause training showed that improvements came when the structure was precise, not when it was chaotic. And so this great video closes with a simple but powerful idea. Pre-exhaustion and rest pause are not just techniques, they are ways of thinking. One teaches how to prepare the stimulus better. The other teaches how to extract more from the stimulus. One places the correct muscle in the spotlight. The other prevents the set from dying too soon. Together they show why heavy duty is not about training by quantity, but about training by precision. And when an iron warrior understands that, they no longer seek to do more out of habit. They seek to do exactly what is necessary to grow, recover, and continue progressing with intelligence. Conclusion: Iron warriors. After this entire journey, after every comparison, every intersection, every technique analyzed from different angles, what remains is not just a set of methods. What remains is a completely different way of understanding training. Because this video was not about saying which technique is better, but about revealing something much deeper. That in heavy duty, progress does not depend on doing more things, it depends on doing the right things at the right time. Throughout this path, techniques like pre-exhaustion, rest pause, drop sets, forced reps, negatives, controlled eccentrics, static contractions even, those finer forms of intensity that many ignore, such as intrinsic control of movement, perfect cadence, clean execution without momentum have all been brought face to face, and all of them have shown something in common. None is magical on its own, but all can be devastating when they are understood and applied with precision. Pre-exhaustion taught iron warriors to prioritize the correct muscle, to not allow auxiliary muscles to steal the work, to build a real and deep connection with the target muscle. Rest pause revealed that failure is not always the end, that there can still be one more response, one more repetition, one more opportunity for growth when the mind wants to stop. Drop sets showed how to extend the stimulus by reducing load. Forced reps taught how to push further with minimal assistance. Negatives opened the door to even deeper intensity in the eccentric phase. And static contractions proved that a muscle can be pushed to the limit even without movement. But here comes the most important truth of all, the one that separates a simple enthusiast from a true iron warrior. It is not about using all the techniques. It is about knowing when to use each one, because using pre-exhaustion without need is wasting energy. Using rest pause without control is destroying recovery. Using drop sets without purpose is accumulating useless fatigue. Using negatives without judgment is paying too high a price. And Mentzer made it clear in his philosophy, it is not more, it is not less, it is precision. That precision is the key to everything. That precision is what turns a set into real growth. That precision is what allows a young person to build a solid foundation, and an iron warrior over 40 to keep progressing without destroying themselves. Because the young must learn to feel, to control, to understand the muscle, and the older must learn to optimize, to protect, to choose intelligently, and both paths meet at the same point, true intensity. Not the intensity of shouting, not the intensity of lifting more weight without control, not the intensity of doing 1,000 exercises, but the intensity Mentzer defended, the intensity that takes the muscle to its exact limit, and then respects recovery as part of growth. Because here is the final great truth. Iron warriors, training does not build the muscle, it stimulates it. Growth happens when the body recovers, and only those who know when to stop will grow. So after this entire journey, the conclusion is not a technique, it is a mindset. A mindset where every set counts, where every repetition has intention, where every rest has purpose, where every decision is guided by reason, not ego. That is true heavy duty, that is the true legacy, and that is the path of the iron warrior. With great respect, great discipline, and with all the intensity that truth demands,